Hi guys, it's Sarah Norris
And Carrie Eink
from the STAR Institute, and we are occupational therapists here at STAR. And what we want to tackle today is a question we often get from families, and it's, is it ADHD? Is it SPD? Could it be both? What do these symptoms mean? And how do we help our loved one that has this myriad of challenges? So we wanted to kind of tackle that, and I think one of the things we wanted to start with was kind of an overview of where our realm and our expertise lies and where it doesn't. And essentially, we're not psychotherapists, we're not neuropsychologists, and we don't diagnose ADHD. So we're going to come from the side of sensory processing, which is what we do know, what we have a lot of experience with, and talk about how we often clinically see an overlap between what has been diagnosed as ADHD and what we see as SPD.
Yeah, and also when to refer out to get additional testing for ADHD. I think that that's a really important thing for us as occupational therapists to remember too, is that we can look from the sensory lens, but knowing that these are two separate neurological conditions, we also need to know what is in our realm and what's not in our realm.
So one of the ways we know that they're two separate neurological conditions is from the research that's been coming out. And there's actually been some really good brain imaging research coming out of UCSF that Elisa Marco and her colleagues have done that do look at the areas of the brain that are affected in ADHD and in SPD, and they have found that they are different areas of the brain. So we'll post some links to her research in the comments so you guys can check that out more. But essentially what we know is that the brain is affected differently by these two conditions. Now that doesn't mean you can't have both, and I think that's one of the things that's confusing for some families is they think that it's got to be an either or, but it can be both. And one of the things that we talk about here is that with two different conditions, whichever ones that you're looking at, if you have two diagnoses, they can be completely separate, and all of the symptoms have no overlap. They have completely different symptomology. But often what we see with individuals with ADHD is some overlap, and sometimes it's a little bit of overlap. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a little bit of symptomology that is both SPD and ADHD, and it's very hard to say it's one or the other. And with some individuals, the overlap is so great that it's very hard to tease out at all which is which. So I think one of the things that we've worked with pediatricians and we've worked with different clinicians outside of the OT world to talk about what's the best way to support these individuals that have this mix and this overlap of symptoms.
Yeah, so thinking about the subtypes of SPD, I think one of the most common referrals that we get are for the sensory cravers, and those sensory cravers that are seeking input in the classroom, at home, in the community, and either the teacher, maybe the pediatrician is saying, okay, is this sensory processing disorder? Is this an ADHD? Can you guys tease it out? And that is a conversation we have very often with families. And the short answer is that it's really not a short answer. And that's really the importance of an evaluation from all the subtypes of SPD, because a lot of times we get kids coming in that are seeking sensory input, but maybe not even because they're a sensory craver. It could be something else, and a lot of times it is something else. So I'm going to go into a couple of those of what it could be. So one of them that I know is really common for us OTs to evaluate is if the kid has postural difficulties. If a child has a postural disorder, they're going to be shifting around in their seat, they're going to be wiggling, fidgeting, trying to stay upright in their chairs, trying to stay upright standing in line, and this can often look like hyperactive behavior. Or laying, I think circle time is a great one for an example of that. The kid is laying down and then they're sitting up, and when we do an evaluation looking at the postural control, we see that this kid has no postural supports to keep themselves upright. And so it's not necessarily that they have the attention deficit, it's that they don't have the support at their core that they need to stay upright and to focus and attend.
And so it looks different than what we kind of, they look like space invaders, right? They look like they're trying to get into other people's personal space. but they honestly don't have that good boundary of their own personal space and their ability to stay within it. So they are constantly leaning and bumping and pushing and having that hard time staying in their own little bubble. And definitely it can be a sensory craving behavior, but more often we do see that it's a result of their postural challenges.
Yeah, another one would be sensory discrimination disorder. So we've talked about this a little bit in previous weeks, but this is the ability to correctly interpret and identify the sensations that are coming in. And so if there's mixed messages coming in, a lot of times from the movement or the touch perspectives and the touch sensations, this can make kids want bigger amounts of these inputs in order to accurately understand what's coming in. So if you have trouble discriminating sensations, the types of sensations that are coming in kind of on a regular basis might not be enough, and they might not be accurately understanding that. So kids who spin or put their head upside down or stomp with really heavy feet, they're looking for more information in order to accurately discriminate sensory information, which can be a really new idea for a lot of the individuals and families that we work with. But once you start understanding sensory discrimination disorder a little bit better, you can see that these kids too look maybe like the ADHD profile or maybe like an ADD profile.
Yeah, and I think that the other ones that we see really commonly that are also discrimination symptoms are the putting things in their mouth, fidgeting with things, always being busy and on the go. And it's not so much a function of I need novelty, I need excitement in my life, it's I need input. And it can be really hard to tease that out at first with a child. It takes some time to really dig down and tease apart why are they doing this. And it's something that you can do if you have the knowledge and the understanding of sensory discrimination, and you can have that, let's look at the function of why these behaviors are occurring, and do they just need more? Do they do better when they've had a really intense sensory rich experience like slip and slides or amusement parks or things like that, where they get really intense input and they're actually calm and they're actually satiated with their senses. And so it can look like sensory seeking, sensory craving. It can also look like out of control hyperactivity. And I think one of the things that I have learned clinically in working with these individuals is that the instinct is to try and help them be calm and get smaller and less intense and to control the stimulation so that they don't get hyper. But what they actually need is the opposite. They need more input.
Yeah, that's a really good point that I've been working even with some of my teenagers recently on, is they were expecting that they needed more calming techniques, and they've learned calming techniques their whole life, when really we put them on a swing or we put them on something that spins, and suddenly then they're feeling attentive, focused. And so that's a really good point, that's really what we're doing in the treatment gyms, is we're looking, what does sensation do? Does it help them be more attentive? Does that help them look more organized? If not, then we continue asking the questions. We continue having the conversations with parents. I think that's such an important thing as a therapist, is letting them know what we know and what we don't know. We're very fortunate to have psychologists on staff that we can go talk to. We have assessments for ADHD here that we have done in the past with some of our families and some of our kids. And so I think those are all really important concepts of looking at what does more stimuli or less stimuli do to attention and to the behavior.
And I think this kind of leads really nicely into, so how do you manage these complex behaviors when there could be an overlap between, yes, there are needs for additional sensory input, but it's not the whole picture. And so these are the clients that we work with that they either come in with already taking medication because they've been recommended to take stimulants or something else to work on their attention, or they're the families that are going through that process of, what is it? Should we try medication? What should we do? And we always, or at least I always, counsel parents that you really have to do what your personal beliefs guide you to. So some families really feel strongly against medication, and that's okay. There's a lot of good reasons for wanting to avoid that. So it's definitely something that we say, okay, let's try it from the sensory side. Let's see how things go. Let's see how we can support. Maybe your child can function in the classroom with just some sensory integration therapy, or we might find out that it's not enough, and then we can talk about next steps. And then there's also the families that are comfortable with medication, and one of the things that I really like is the concept of medication can't fix bad therapy, but it can enhance good therapy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one thing that I always encourage parents to do when I'm having these delicate conversations is finding a psychiatrist, if you're going the medication route, finding a psychiatrist who's collaborative in nature, as well as who is monitoring these medications and seeing, are they making the behaviors better? Are they making the child more of the child that we want them to be? Or are they not working? It's not our realm, but what we know from working with kids in the gym is that sometimes a medication isn't necessarily a fix among all kids. Kids respond differently to medications. Kids respond differently to treatment. And so I think the more, again, that we can be collaborative with psychiatrists, with psychologists that are also working in tandem, if it is ADHD and SPD, that can be a really good kind of multidisciplinary approach as well.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I've learned from the adolescents and adults that I've worked with that have ADHD as well as SPD is that when they find a medication that helps, they really feel like they can be themselves. Mm-hmm. They can control themselves, they can function, they can focus, and it can be life-changing. So sometimes medication is necessary and important, and we definitely had that conversation with families of the right answer is going to be the right answer for your family.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Again, our teenagers and adults, they teach us so much, and I think medications is one of the routes that gets them to us eventually is, I've tried all these medications, none of them worked, and so maybe it is just SPD and that nobody's actually addressed the sensory-based concerns at hand. And so being an advocate for your child and kind of having that gut instinct of, do I feel like this is making my child a better child? Does this seem like a good fit? That's just a really important area to think about.
So one other thing I want to make sure we cover is talking about how I think a lot of times it's very easy to think that SPD is ADHD when you have those postural or those sensory discrimination challenges, but there are other ways that it can also present. And I think one of the ways that Carrie and I talked about before we came on video was how when you're over-responsive to sensations, that can really impact your attention and your focus as well.
Yeah, so if you remember, sensory over-responsivity is when you have difficulty filtering one type of sensation from all the other sensations. You're having all of them coming in way too fast, way too much. And so it becomes really challenging to be able to filter out background noises, background touch, and this can result in kids, adolescents, adults they're tuning into everything in their environment. And this has been another area that I've learned a lot from my teenagers and adults that I work with is just what a classroom or a grocery store can feel like from an attention standpoint when you have over-responsivity. It is, you are hearing every noise or you're feeling every sort of touch grazing you as you're walking by somebody. And so imagining what that can look like to maybe a teacher that's expressing concerns and thinking about the over-responsivity subtype as well.
Mm-hmm. And it can be one of those things where the teachers or even the employers are saying, he's a good worker, but he is just always off task. And it takes a lot to get him to come back. And what we know from the research is that none of us are very good at multitasking, and so when you have that inability to screen out extraneous information, your attention is being pulled away constantly, and it's exhausting to have that kind of ping pong with your brain of alert, I gotta focus, alert, I gotta focus, and so it can be really exhausting. So it can start out with that, I'm over-alerting, I'm over-orienting to my environment, but it can eventually come to that point of exhaustion where I'm not processing anything anymore. So it can be really tricky to tease out all of these different symptoms and to definitely track it throughout the day to see, well, what's he like in the morning, what's he like in the afternoon, what's he like before bedtime, and really looking as big as we can at the full picture of an individual and pulling in other disciplines to help us address these more challenging and complex issues.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. This made me think of when we were interviewing Jennifer Allison the other week, and she was talking about the accommodations that she got at work, and just moving into a smaller, more single, less multisensory office made a world of a difference for her for the SPD and the over-responsivity. And I think that's such a good point, because those wouldn't necessarily be the same accommodations that we would use in an individual with ADHD. And I think that's a good example of how her attention, she talked about how incredibly much better her attention got just being in a less overwhelming environment.
And I think one of the other really favorite examples that I have is actually my own daughter. She's an over-responder, and she's also a sensory craver, which is weird. And she has just this limited capacity throughout the day for stimulation, and the more she gets, the crazier she feels. And by the end of the day, she is bouncing off the walls, and she looks hyperactive, and she looks like she needs to be medicated so she can sleep. But what she really needs is less stimulation throughout the day, and more stimulation in a way that she can process it at a slower rate. So just thinking about how sometimes we think that kids are showing us behaviors that mean one thing, and they really could mean something else entirely.
Yeah, so again, we'll post the research on these subjects. We'd love to hear from you. If you guys know of any research, if you guys have any comments, we'd love to hear from psychologists on this issue and start the conversation.
And thanks for watching. I wanted to say one more thing, that we are in our Sensory Awareness Month, and we just love all the research that supports what we do clinically. We also know that there's more research that needs to be done, especially on the treatment end of things, and so we would really, really appreciate any contributions that you are able to make towards that. So there will be a link in the comments to donate.
Thanks, guys.